Igama likaQamata lakuhlala lingcwele, igama lakhe lakuhlala lintloni ngokuba ungumdala ongajongwayo, ngokuba ungumdala ongolathwayo. Sondele kunike bokhokho, sinqule kunike iminyanya, sithi sithethezeni namasiko enu mawakhe igazi lethu. Thulani emithanjeni yethu ukuxabisa okokwethu, hlaziyani ezingqondweni zethu kuzazi uba sisisizwe. Dedisani ilifu elimnyama ebomini bethu kuvele ukhanya. Sinike namathongo ahlambulukileyo ngawo suze impilo nethamsanqa ngokuba amandla negunya lelenu masitheni icamako. Sitamakushe kwezohlelo zakwatshawe zakwatshiwe zakwaphawuda zakwalo zakwabhuti zakwabontomnyana zithi masitheni icamako. Amatshonya nodikizo sawo nkomo omthuzimele masitamakusheni. Amandakwendo tyebele entlome ntuko libe lokhwangwashe masitheni icamako. Oqhene bogqugqo sithonga sithatha udokana mahlathi masitheni icamako. Amanqosi nociko shothi tibonozinga abantu bomlambo masitheni icamako. Zonke izizwe ezingqongileyo ngakhange ndizibize masitheni icamako. Ndicenga nini ukwenzela uba ninihlanganise nezihlolo zakwajambasi zakwalisa zakwamsuthu masitheni icamako. Ukwenzela uba ngeli xesha utata ujambasi xa sisincokola ngaye asondele phakathi kwethu masitheni icamako. Ukwenzela uba ulwimi lethu lungagobi masitheni icamako. Ukwenzela uba amadolo wethu angagediseli masitheni icamako. Masitamakushini. You see, Mangaliso Sobukwe, he told us that noma sesingasekho bayawuze basho bathi sasikhona. That's how determined Mangaliso Sobukwe was, and how he had a sense of self-esteem, a very high one. So that therefore Mangaliso Sobukwe was impressing to us that he need not ask for an acknowledgement from others to recognize him, to acknowledge him. These and their works alone stand as a firm recognition and self-recognition. And so Mangaliso Sobukwe, in that sense, was teaching us that his voice could not be silenced. Try as much as they would want to, try as much as they could, but Mangaliso Sobukwe's voice could not be silenced. And so at this point in time, my brothers and sisters, let me begin by establishing a point of disagreement and say that Mangaliso Sobukwe's voice was never silenced. Because Mangaliso Sobukwe's voice could not be contained in an audiovisual. With or without an audiovisual, Mangaliso Sobukwe's voice remains with us because Mangaliso Sobukwe lives in our hearts and Mangaliso Sobukwe lives in our minds. And so, Mangaliso Sobukwe speaks and Mangaliso Sobukwe speaks non-stop. And so Mangaliso Sobukwe's voice was not silenced. But before we point fingers, because we have this tendency as Pan-Africanists, especially as members of the Pan-Afrikanist Congress, to point a finger somewhere else and not recognize our own complicity and capability of imprisoning and silencing. If ever there are people who are responsible and guilty of having tried to silence Mangaliso Sobukwe, it is the members within the Pan-Afrikanist Congress of Azania. Because you see, in the revolution, we've always known and expected nothing from our enemies but cruelty. Nothing less we expected from them. But when some of us, young lions, joined the liberation movement, the Pan-Afrikanist Congress in particular, the young sons and daughters of the soil were broken within that movement. When they tried to listen and heed the voice of Mangaliso Sobukwe in the basic document of the PAC and say that it is meet that we speak the truth while we are still alive in the footsteps of Mangaliso Sobukwe. And when those sons and daughters tried to do so, they were punished and broken within the Pan-Afrikanist Congress in the lonely world of exile, where they could not see their mothers and sisters and brothers, where they could not see their families. Their spirit was broken in exile by the so-called leaders of the Pan-Afrikanist Congress of Azania. It is meant that we speak the truth while we are still alive. Mangaliso Sobukwe taught us that we should not be afraid at all. We shall not be driven by fear at all. And if we die, it is good that we should die. That we had, even as we go into the powers of the soil, we would be alive because we would be able to meet Mangaliso Sobukwe and say, Sobukwe, we never betrayed your mission. We never betrayed your mission. We never betrayed your mission. And there are those who shall not come next to us and be able to declare that they can't. They will not, without a sense of shame, they can't. Within the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. And so, when we were living in 1988 and arriving, and I want to play for the first time that tribute to those sons of the soil that we met in Bulawayo, young men in the Azanian People's Liberation Army, carrying the submachine, the Scorpion submachine. We met them in Bulawayo, and they said to us, sons of the soil, today we are going into occupied Azania to engage with the enemy forces. There are chances that we may not come back. There are chances that we may die. And so we plead with you, sons of the soil, that as you proceed to Harare in Zimbabwe, you are going to meet reactionary misleaders in the PAC. And I emphasize reactionary misleaders, not leaders, because there's a difference between a leader and a misleader. They said, we're going, we may die and never come back. But please, sons of the soil, whatever happens, but you know, magwenzakalani, ma-Afrika, ningayiwisi part. They knew they were reactionary misleaders in the movement. As they were going to lay down their lives, they knew that they may not be coming back. But in spite and despite this, they said to us, Ningayilahli ipati. I recall today those followers of Mangaliso Sobukwe, those young men who I do not know to this very day if they made it alive to begin with in Azania, and if they made it, whether or not they came back. And you see those sons and daughters of the soil, those sons had that audacity to come home because Mangaliso Sobukwe lived in their hearts. Mangaliso Sobukwe lived in their minds. Mangaliso Sobukwe's voice, without any audio, was speaking non-stop. Because Mangaliso Sobukwe taught us. He taught us that we cannot love Africa enough. We can never love Africa. In fact, it is on that basis that the voice of Mangaliso Sobukwe lives. Because Mangaliso Sobukwe taught us that a doctrine of hatred will not take anyone everywhere. Mangaliso Sobukwe taught us that ours is to love the African people all the time. But we misunderstood in the moment of anger and frustration and bitterness. We did not catch the voice and the message of Mangaliso Sobukwe. That is why at all times our preoccupation at all times has been with the African National Congress what the ANC does and what the ANC does not do. Whether the ANC recognizes the PAC's leaders or whether the ANC does not recognize the PAC's leaders. Mangaliso Sobukwe was never about that. When Mangaliso Sobukwe launched the Positive Action Campaign on March 21, he invited first and foremost the African National Congress. When the African National Congress refused, Mangaliso Sobukwe said, with or without the ANC, the Pan-Afrikanist Congress of Azania is going forward. And so the PAC, led by Mangaliso Sobukwe, was not seeking for the acknowledgement or, for that matter, the recognition of the African National Congress, because self-recognition and self-acknowledgement, convinced and confident on the basis of our ideological orientation, Mangaliso Sobukwe understood that when the leaders of the PAC speak, the people are going to respond, because the language of the PAC is succinct. The languages of the PAC speaks to the minds and the hearts of the African people. Mangaliso Sobukwe's voice could not be silenced. Zandi, it's a issue. And the phone up and the Obama did question. And so when the Pan-Afrikanist Congress of Azania, many of us do not know this, when the Pan-Afrikanist Congress of Azania had its inaugural launch, the meeting of the Pan-Afrikanist Congress of Azania began 3 minutes before the scheduled time. 3, it's on record. 3 minutes before the scheduled time, the Pan-Afrikanist Congress of Azania's meeting began. Because Mangaliso Sobukwe was making a point that we shall not advance in this revolution unless we're able to have a sense of discipline, a sense of self-control, a sense of clarity. And those are the things that we yet have to learn. But I do recall 30 years ago this year, when we arrived in Zimbabwe, some of us, we were told by our leaders, and it was a refrain, that if the ANC takes over the country at 12 midnight, the PAC will take the country 5 minutes after 12 midnight. It is because at that time, you see, we were being prepared by those who knew better what their agenda was, that would become rebels, that would be preoccupied with the ANC, and that our struggle is nothing else but the ANC. That is why we are so preoccupied at all times with the ANC. When the ANC announces a Release Mandela campaign, we must release a Release Mutuping campaign. When the ANC says we're going to negotiate, even though we said that we do not recognize the legitimacy of the South African government, we see our leaders going into that illegitimacy. And when the time is up, being cartooned in a newspaper, running into Swaziland as if. A contradiction in terms. And so, Zandi, and my brothers and sisters, this is it. The Pan-Afrikanist Congress was an African nationalist organization. The first aim of the PAC says to rally and unite the African people on the basis of African nationalism. The ideology of the Pan-Afrikanist Congress was Pan-Africanism, continues to be Pan-Africanism. When others to this very day are dilly-dallying between capitalism and socialism, the Pan-Afrikanist Congress, from its beginning, from its inception, said that we are establishing an Africanistic, democratic, and socialist order. The PAC, from its inception, has always been a socialist movement. But guess what? Because we had a deep sense of inferiority complex, even as we were members of the PAC. We needed validation. When the Chinese gave us training, we came back being Maoists.
we could hardly define and elucidate Pan-Africanism. We became a Maoist party and less of a Pan-Africanist party. And when we began to read a little bit of Marxism, because we wanted to be sound international, as if Pan-Africanism was never international from its very inception, the Pan-Afrikanist Congress said, Mangaliso Sobukwe said, we are fighting for the noblest cause on earth, the liberation of mankind. So from the very beginning, the Pan-Afrikanist Congress was an internationalist movement. But because we did not even understand that, we had to be acceptable to others and declare ourselves Marxist-Leninists, even before we could explain what is Pan-Africanism and African nationalism. And so we are the ones, Ma-Afrika man, who silenced and sought to silence Mangaliso Sobukwe. Because we were not liberated in our minds. We thought we were. We never understood Fanon when Fanon said to us, but to declare negation is not in itself an act of negation. To declare yourself a Pan-Africanist does not necessarily make you a Pan-Africanist. And we know, you see, because of this, there were some misleaders. I spent a lot of time with these misleaders in Zimbabwe. And there they were. He comes into a meeting of the Pan-Afrikanist Congress, 5 minutes. Am I correct? He comes into a meeting of young people, this misleader of the PAC. He opens and says, he doesn't even say Israel. No, he doesn't. He says, Bantwana bam, imnandi ndoda. And he goes on as if there is no contradiction. He says, ningacingi ukuba bantwana bam asinibaweli. Siyanibawela bantwana bam. There's no sense of irony in this man who's supposed to be a father and supposed to be talking to his daughters in a meeting of the Pan-Afrikanist Congress that is supposed to promote and to project the African image and personality. He says, umntwana mna dakumthi wende ebhedini dimhamse. He even had this bodily language. Dimhamse. And so these are the people who killed and tried to silence the voice of Mangaliso Sobukwe. Because when those sons and daughters of the soil arrived, very young in the movement, at the ages of 17 and 18, and began to see this, slowly but surely, they were being destroyed in their minds and their hearts. And that, of course, was the agenda of these misleaders. In the land of the Zimbabwean people, when this man who thinks that he has got the right because he's leading the party in Zimbabwe, says that, uba wena ukenda kuva ba ukuhambena la nkwenkwe yomshona ndikuthatha ndikufake pha ebhudini. In right in Zimbabwe, in a land of the Shona-speaking Africans, he dares to despise the people who have fought for their freedom. And he thinks that manhood is reduced to the cutting of a foreskin. Because he calls the other one a boy, and he thinks that he's a man because his foreskin has been cut. And we wonder, in fact, if he was able to stand with that pain after all when he was there. And anyway, now I'm sitting down, and I'm going to sit down, Zandi, before my 3 minutes is up. And as I'm sitting down, I want to say that, no. Mangaliso Sobukwe leads. His voice is not silent. The sons of the PAC sang a song, Ndicela isibindi, sokunqama ubumbam, Ndicela isibindi, sokunqama ubomi bam, ndilandela abaninzi, abafele tabini, befela isifungo, befele matafeni. Many years later, the sons and daughters sang, Vume moya wam, vume moya wam, kawuvume moya wam. uyavuma khawuvume ekhawuvume moya wami ekhawuvume moya wami ekhawuvume moya wami uyavuma